Hey there, we have a big favor to ask, and we promise it will only take a few minutes. As you know, our show is supported by sponsors, and we would love to hear your feedback. Head to podcast.study and fill out a short, anonymous survey to let us know your thoughts. Again, that's podcast.study, and thanks. Hello, and welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast. My name is Jody Avirgan, and yes, that sound you hear, listeners, your ears have not deceived you. That is our old theme music. It is back. Please clap. We're so psyched.
No,
right?
I've never cared about our theme music.
Wow.
Lots of other people
Listeners
do.
sure have.
I don't remember what the old theme music is.
Well, it's playing right now. Look, the House model is out. There's 2.5 months till Election Day, but none of that indicates the proper start of the election. No, it's the return of the old elections theme music that officially marks it. Shout out to everyone who's been tweeting me multiple times a week for the last many, many months saying, bring that music back, bring that music back. Well, here it is. And it will be with us at least through the election.
I like how the traditional start of the campaign is after Labor Day, but we're saying, screw that. Let's get going now.
Yeah, well, we released our model, and that is actually where we're going to sort of kick off today, because this does feel like a proper 2018 election kickoff. And here to celebrate that and the return of the elections music, and maybe even provide a little wisdom about the election itself, our senior politics writer, Claire Malone. Hello, Claire. Welcome back.
Hey, Jody.
I missed you.
Good to be back.
And managing editor, Micah Cohen.
Hello.
Micah Cohen, managing editor. New title.
New title.
Congratulations.
New outlook on life.
Uh-huh.
You know.
And should we give a shout out as related to that title that Micah has now become
Micah
the managing
started spinning.
But there's also some sort of related news that we should give people a heads up about related to your moving up as overseer of the whole site.
We announced this late last week. We are super excited to be welcoming Sarah Frostenson, who's a graphics editor at Politico currently, or as of last week. She's joining us as our new politics editor starting in September. She's going to bring all kinds of new wisdom to the site.
So we're excited to have Sarah on board. And we should also say that Nate Silver, not on board for today's podcast. Nate possibly legit catching up on sleep probably at this moment.
No, actually, he's building the Senate
He's building
model.
the Senate model.
Yeah.
Okay. And actually, why don't we just answer that question right off the bat? Listeners have been asking, is there going to be a Senate model? Is there going to be a governor's model? And yes, we rolled out the House model, and then we're going to go into those too. So today we're going to follow up on that House model and get Claire and Micah's thoughts on what it shows right off the bat. And then in a larger sense, I'd love to have a conversation about our reporting priorities going into November. And then in the second half of the show, we're going to look at some new data that paints a picture of the Trump coalition. Pew recently published a bunch of new survey data on the makeup of his coalition in 2016 and how his voters feel about him now in 2018. And some of that data, for instance, contradicts the 2016 exit poll. So we'll have a conversation about that. But let's begin with this year. And actually, we got a pretty simple but important question from a listener named Josh, and we can just start with that. So he wrote in and he said, and I'm quoting him here, "What's the point of the model? Who is it for? How should I use it? I've read the explainers by Nate on how it was built, but that was more what than why. So I'll throw this to you two, and then we can get into the specifics. But, Micah, why do we make a forecast, and how should our audience approach it?"
Josh, what's the point of anything, really?
That's actually a fair question. Claire's, not yours, Josh's. Yours is stupid. No, I'm just kidding. I actually
don't take it back. Keep this podcast cutting edge.
I actually love Josh's question. The reason we build the forecast is because we human beings, we at 538 and human beings in general, are not good at taking in a lot of information and synthesizing it into one. My lisp is coming out into one outlook. So I'll give you an example. It's like, okay, let's say we get a poll in California 45, which has a Republican incumbent, showing the Democrat up 3. And then we get a poll in Ohio 12 showing the Republican up 2. And then we get a bunch of generic ballot national polls showing Democrats leading by 8. Well, what the hell would you do with all that information? People do things, normal political onlookers try to make sense of that information, and historically have tried to make sense of that information. To use an easier example, think about during the 2008 election when, you get a poll showing McCain up 5 in Indiana and Obama up 3 in Pennsylvania, and you kind of weigh them all together and you're like, oh, I think Obama's winning this race, or I think this seems 50-50, right? Based on how the media has traditionally described elections, people are really bad at that. In fact, during the 2016 election, I found myself being really bad at that in questioning the model and going against the model.
I mean, I think one way that I sort of think about it is human beings very much like to live in the moment and live in their biases. So you might say, if you're living in the moment and a poll comes out where one candidate is up by a lot, and you think that the state of Pennsylvania is a really important state, then you might weigh those two things heavily, whereas the model takes all of the information and tries to give you a real overview and say, these are all the polls from the past. This is how, and it kind of gives you, it takes you out of the moment and it takes you away from where your neural pathways go, saying Pennsylvania is the most important, Ohio is the most important, and it says, here's sort of the dispassionate data over a period of time.
And weighing that data based on basically what would have been the best way to weigh it historically.
Right.
So to give you a really concrete example of this, during the 2016 election, our forecast was showing Trump as having a real chance of winning, right? It was like about a 1 in 3 chance. And we were getting a ton of shit for this, right? Meanwhile, I'm reading that criticism every day, and I'm looking at all these early vote data, which rationally I know is not a good predictor of elections, but it's showing Clinton doing well, right? And I'm going into Nate's office and being like, what is up with our forecast? Like, why is Trump so far ahead? And, Nate, to his credit, would back the model, but we would we worry about this stuff. We worry about what...
It took a toll on Nate, I feel like.
It took a toll on me. So in the last days of the campaign, I was literally rooting for our model to improve for Clinton because I thought Clinton would win, right? Well, we know how that turned out. For listeners, we don't change the forecast once we launch it, right? It's a model that kind of runs, right? In other words, even me, brilliant as I am, situated at 538, which is supposed to be this dispassionate...
Hashtag managing editor.
Yeah. This is the real
Hashtag New Lease on Life.
But Instagram influencer.
It's really easy to fall prey to those biases. So that's the answer is we build a model because
we are human beings and fallible.
Yeah, and it's the systematic way the model goes about weighing new information.
And so that point exactly, I think, is something that clicked for me in 2016, understanding this, and I think is important to remember again that it's like a framework in which to process new information. And I think a lot of people, and we fall into this sometimes too, get really hung up on the sort of predictive outcome notion of it. And it's really, I think, the more about like day to day, watching it change, seeing what affects it, what doesn't affect it, and having that kind of just provide space in which to be a little more rigorous. That said, Micah, there is, a forecast, a number. When people go to our site, they see it. And so how should people process that kind of like, this is what we think is going to happen on election day, overall top line number that's sitting at the top of this thing?
So this perfectly sets up the other big reason we do a forecast is to account for uncertainty. In other words, the model is a really good way, much better than humans, at systematically weighing new information, right? It's also a very good way to look at that information and be like, where does this leave us, right? So if I tell you guys right now, hey, the generic ballot shows Democrats ahead by 8 percentage points, you could probably reliably conclude that the environment favors Democrats. But there's still a little over 2 months to go before Election Day. How much faith should you put that number will hold up? What the model does is it looks historically and it says, here's how much uncertainty there is. So right now we have Democrats as about a 3 in 4 chance of winning the House. The reason we do a probability, or in this case odds, is as an expression of that uncertainty. I hope people learned this in 2016, but in 2016 when we had Trump as about a 1 in 3 chance, that means one out of three times, is going to win. So it's an expression, it's a way to account for and express uncertainty.
And we've done a few things sort of presentation wise. Maybe Model Talk will get a little bit more into that, but I think just looking at it top line, I think we've done a lot more to show that uncertainty. We're showing this confidence interval. We've started talking about it more in 3 and 4 versus 75.3%, which I think is an interesting lesson maybe from last election about kind of how people process probability.
Yeah, be curious.
Yeah.
Do you find that more helpful, Claire, or less helpful than the win probability?
So for listeners, I've been offline, and I actually pretty much just looked at this forecast last night. I guess it launched Thursday.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the starkest thing that I noticed, which is when you go to the model, I'm looking at today, Monday, August 20th at noonish, and it says there's a 3 and 4 chance Democrats win control, and inside parentheses it says 75.3%. I do think there is less chance that people confuse the percent, because the percentage is de-emphasized, and we give the 3 and 4 as the big, bold numbering. That seems to be more in line with how people naturally think about probabilities, like in the rest of our daily lives. You say I don't know, there's a 50-50 there's a 50-50 chance, there's a 3 and 4 chance. You don't usually say there's a 75.3% chance that the Democrats
Nate says it just like that.
Yeah, Nate says that.
There's a 75.3% chance it'll rain. We don't say that. We talk in
I think that's right. And
it's more vernacular.
Yeah,
the way we're doing it.
I think it's clear. I hope it's clear to people. It's why we did it. I'd be curious what listeners think. But to me, the main thing is that 1 in 4 chance that Republicans have right now of keeping control. I want people going to our forecast to believe in that, and to pay attention to that. And I think that's harder if you just see 75%. Your mind doesn't go to that 25% automatically that's left over, right?
I mean, it's sort of like you were saying, it's almost as much about the uncertainty as it is about the actual prediction, right?
It's one of the main reasons
the backside
we do
of the coin,
or whatever. It's one of the main reasons we do it is to measure, okay, given everything we know now, how confident should we be that we know what's going on here? And the answer is not all that confident.
Yeah. And I do think, for listeners who are paying attention to certain House races, because maybe they live in those districts, seeing on the map, if you scroll down right below, it is nice to see that sort of preview of, okay, here's the chance of winning, So I randomly clicked on Texas 24th. Kenny Marchant has a 19 and 20 chance of winning. Things like that are kind of I think it's a helpful way of putting that vernacular in people's head rather than the percentage, which can be a little bit more amorphous and confusing.
So, Claire, as you hinted at, you've been living with this thing for about a day or so. We've all been, just a few, less than a day. For us, it's only been a few days, but I'm curious if we could talk about some of our main takeaways now that we've spent a little time with it. And I'll say that Galen and Nate did a Model Talk segment last week that was really helpful in terms of understanding how the model was built on the back end. But in terms of what it shows on the front end, maybe we can all just throw out a couple key takeaways that we've noticed. So, Claire, you want to jump in and say and say kind of what jumped out at you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that the battle for the House takes place not just in a region, but all over the country is really striking. We spent a lot of time in 2016 talking about, and right after 2016, talking about the upper Midwest and, the South. We like to parcel out the country into regions, and often regional stereotypes, as I learned when I was a freshman in college, are very true.
What was that particular stereotype?
I didn't know. One thing that was striking as a Midwesterner going to the East Coast, where boarding schools are very popular.
Wait, where'd you go to college?
I went to Georgetown.
Oh, right.
And I in my, as my friend Maura puts it so well, she's also from Cleveland. She says, where we grew up, boarding schools were for bad kids. And so
that's funny.
And so when I got to the East Coast, and I was like, what's Choate Rosemary Hall? Is that a military academy for assholes? Which, maybe it is.
Kind of.
But anyway, that was a regional stereotype about the East Coast. My general point is one of the striking things about the 2018 midterms is that the fight for the House happens. It's sort of flattened. It's happening everywhere. And that is something that our numbers tell us, and kind of in my way of thinking about it, it does sort of get to the idea of, in my head, of this kind of flattening of culture and politics across the country. I think we used to have a lot more economic differences by region. Now I think we have a lot of, someone who went to college and lives in Ohio has a lot in common actually with someone who went to college and lives in Texas, even if they're not living in the same region.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of as we have talked about before on this podcast, there's a lot of differentiation between classes in America now, and often it has to do with education. And I think that's kind of interesting, the fact that all around the country, not just in the upper Midwest where people maybe have economic anxiety, like everywhere is kind of dealing with this, with very similar dynamics. And I think it's a much more complicated problem about what's the future of our economy, blah, blah, blah. But just the idea that our politics has flattened a little bit in this race, and it's happened, all these contests are happening everywhere. I think that's really interesting.
So that was actually my main takeaway too.
The great minds, right?
Damn it. No, yeah. No, I struggled with this a little bit because, so this actually will contradict a little bit what Claire just said, but I do feel like the parties are so well sorted now by education, by race, by a bunch of other stuff, that it is somewhat surprising to me the extent to which our forecast shows the battleground districts are incredibly diverse. Not racially diverse, but diverse in having really white districts, non-white districts, urban districts, rural districts, suburban districts, right? And so I kept thinking, like, that's kind of weird in the sense of so much of our politics breaks down along some of these lines, right? Urban versus rural, stuff like that. Why isn't the response to Trump breaking down along those lines? And then this is just a theory, but I kept thinking about it. I was like, well, here's one explanation. In the way that like education was a defining fault line in the 2016 election, it seems like a defining fault line in 2018 is gender. And gender is one fault line that has no geographic pattern, right? There's not, areas of the country that are much more male heavy than other areas. That's mostly true, right? And so if gender is going to be
sorry to San Francisco.
Yeah. If gender is going to be the defining fault line in 2018, then maybe you would expect to see less of a geographic pattern.
We got a lot of notes from people sort of with their takeaways and sort of related to this. And the thing that kind of jumped out to me as well is, yes, a lot of these competitive districts are scattered and maybe cut against some of these lines. But to me, the map also shows how many districts are just not competitive and how polarized so much of our country is. And I remember on election night in 2016, even before we knew who was going to win, as the results coming in, that was the conversation in our office, was like, oh my gosh, this election is showing us just how big the divide is. And here a map pops up again and just kind of lays that home. So I don't know if these are contradictory ideas, that the sort of playing field is wide, but still so much of the playing field is not actually a playing field. I mean, are those things that, how do we go about squaring those two?
No, I don't think those are in contradiction. I mean, the way districts are drawn in this country is screwy. And actually the way districts are drawn, like, it's not that different than the Electoral College in that it doesn't sort of perfectly correspond with the way our society is actually set up. But yeah, going by our current forecast, there are 190 districts that are safely Democratic. We don't use safe, actually, that are solidly Democratic. That means our model gives the Democrat at least a 95% chance of winning. And there are 133 districts that are solidly Republican. That's most districts. It's only a small minority. There are 112 districts that are at least somewhat competitive according to our model, which is, again, actually a really broad playing field historically because so much of our country is not competitive. But you're right that most of the country falls into these buckets that go one way or the other consistently.
Another thing people have flagged for us, we've talked about a lot on this show, but it is that Democrats in particular are playing everywhere. What is the metaphor that when a wave hits, like, you don't know exactly which shore it's going to wash up on, so you want to be standing there in order to pick up the shells?
I think when a wave hits,
what a metaphor!
You know exactly what shore it's going to hit.
No, but I mean, but you want to be playing everywhere because you never know. In some random district, if there's truly a wave, it may tip, and Democrats seem to have done. I mean, this reinforces again something that we've talked about a lot, but Democrats really are playing everywhere and positioning themselves to take advantage of a wave if it does hit. Right?
No, that's right. That's right. I mean, Nate talked about this on Model Talk, but the House, much more than the presidential race, is 435 separate races where there's different candidates on the ballot. There's different local conditions. So it is a bunch of separate races. Now, there's some correlation race to race, but for that reason, you sort of can't say, and there's a temptation to do this in the narrative, like, oh, we're going to make a suburban play. Well, if you do that, and if the DNC or DCCC is only pouring money into like suburban districts, and those districts just happen to go against them, then they've sort of screwed themselves. Where it's much smarter to sort of spread your chips out on the roulette table.
Yeah, because you also might have, House races are so interesting because usually the polling's pretty shitty.
Yeah.
There are such interesting political quirky things that happen in certain districts. Like, maybe the Democrats think that they're a shoo-in for this thing, but everyone thinks the Democratic candidate is an asshole and
right.
Used to get in bar fight, whatever it is. Like everyone has these particular little things, or maybe there's a weird local issue like weeding out deer. Do we want to kill the deer in our district? Like the people is there like a pit bull ban here? And what does this candidate think about that? Like there's lots of really weird, quirky things that happen. And so, this goes way back to the thing that Howard Dean kind of still dines out on, which is his 50-state strategy, right? Where it's like, we're just going to go whole hog and say we're playing everywhere, and then we'll win what we win. And even if we don't win, we've tried.
No, and look, one of the reasons Democrats can play everywhere is it's a very good environment for them.
Yeah,
which means Republicans are retiring, which means Democrats are raising a ton of money. That's one of the Nate talked about this, but that's one of the kind of most meaningful indicators in our forecast. Democrats are just outraising Republicans in a bunch of districts, even incumbent Republicans.
Yeah. And you are, and I think to the idea of you're playing in a lot of districts all across the country, you're seeing a lot of different kinds of Democrats being elected in these primaries and going into the general election, which I think is a really interesting thing for the party. So you're seeing, in 2 years, they're going to nominate someone to be their one nominee for the party, someone who will encapsulate their entire identity, blah, blah, blah. But right now they're seeing hundreds of different candidates who represent different parts of the Democratic Party, which is necessary for them to win. They need to play the map and play all the different flavor of Democrat. But then they're also having at the same time this existential identity crisis about who is the one capital D Democrat who we're going to choose in 2 years. And that's an interesting thing to watch happen.
And going back to your question, Jody, earlier on about like what reporting lines are we interested coming out of this and following up, is having those two things, you have to keep those in your head simultaneously of like who the party is nominating, for Republicans too, who the parties are nominating in all these races is in a very real way what the parties are. It's like, on a very granular basis, who you put on the ballot in all these races says what you stand for as a party, who belongs to your party, what your priorities are, right? And being comfortable with the mosaic nature of that information, you have to be comfortable with that in a midterm election. At the same time, to Claire's point, in 2 years, they're going to have to be like, that's all well and good. We have to pick one person. So like, what can we learn about the Democratic Party from the candidates on the ballot this year, where they're running, where they're doing well based on the forecast? What can we learn about the party? And then separately, what can we learn about what the party might do in 2020? Like those are somewhat different questions.
Any other reporting priorities you guys want to throw out since we sort of transition into some of the bigger things we're going to report? I mean, you can get specific.
I haven't had that meeting yet with my editors.
Maybe we can have it right now. But no, specific races where I want to go to this district and check out this race, or these larger, bigger themes like you were just describing.
To me, the big one is gender. Or okay, if we want to narrow it down,
let's talk about sex, baby.
To me, the big one is sex. No, to me, the big one is gender. If you want to narrow it down a little bit, I would say white Republican women. What do they do in 2018? Who do they vote for? Do they mobilize? To me, that's the main story. I think you could also make an argument for like Obama Trump voters. I think that's interesting. I'll just keep going here. I also think we have seen a ton of non-white, non-male candidates, non-straight candidates win these Democratic primaries. What do minority voters do in 2018 after it's to me, it's like the next chapter in the post-Obama story. Is like in 2016, Clinton suffered a bit from, black turnout was depressed somewhat from the Obama levels. It's like, what do those voters do in 2018? Those are the big ones for me, I think. But what else? Something Trump related?
Something Trump.
No, yeah, Trump. What do Republican candidates say about Trump? Mm-hmm. I guess that's interesting. Are you interested in that? Do you care what they say about Trump?
No. I'm more interested in the gender and race stuff.
Of the Democratic candidates?
Democratic candidates.
What about the Republican candidates? Are we interested in anything about them?
I feel like that playbook is a little old in my head, because a lot of them, depending on your district, you either wholeheartedly embrace Trump or you embrace the Trump presidency, the Trump era. Right? Democrats, I think, are a more interesting thing to me because, as you said, the gender thing is interesting. A lot of new activists, often who are white college-educated women, but then some of these high-profile candidates, like, Georgia governor's race, that's kind of interesting just as like a new, it's sort of a little bit of an audacious experiment, which sounds a little sad because, you have the first female black governor candidate, but, it is a first, right? So you want to see how it plays in a state like Georgia, and I think races like that around the country. Obviously, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has become like basically like the younger version of Nancy Pelosi in the idea of like being kind of a magnet for conservative criticism, and I don't know. It's like an interesting.
No, and I want to look at this because we did this big project looking at. I'm going to sign this, so I don't want to. But we did this big thing looking at how different types of Democrats were doing in these primaries. But one thing I'm curious about is, are Democratic voters and is the party apparatus more likely to put forward non-white, non-male candidates in really blue district versus more competitive districts? Perry has this piece that'll go up in the next couple of days about this whole conversation about electability, right? And he's talking about it mostly related to the 2020 election and some of the responses we got to his piece on Kamala Harris. But in a country that's still majority white, and in a country where a lot of people are sexist and a lot of people are racist, any conversation about electability kind of inherently puts non-white, non-male, non-straight candidates at a disadvantage. So this question of like, what kind of districts are these candidates getting on the ballot in and how do they do is super interesting to me.
Sort of related. We touched on this a little bit last week when we talked about that work we'd done, but I'm curious about whether this will be eventually seen. It may take 2, 4, 8, 10 years to see this, but as a big mobilizing election where a lot of people as candidates got in, and even if they lost, they stay in politics. And, I don't know, maybe there's a chance we look back at 2018 and say, wow, that was a big turning point, particularly for the Dems, but also for Republicans as well.
Well, for Democrats, I mean, Claire, you have done some thinking about sort of the Democratic bench and how bereft it was. Do you feel like it's being filled up?
What's your bereftometer?
I'm not going to answer your question directly, but what I will say is I think it will be a little bit historically facile to point to a single election and say that's what changed candidate quality. What I will say is I do think people's notions, when they conjure up a politician in their head and when they conjure up figures of authority in their head, I certainly know that I grew up being unconsciously trained to take men in suits seriously, right? Or usually white men, to take them more seriously, frankly, than other people. And I know that coming up in journalism, that was not explicitly, but inherently reinforced. And I think that girls and boys growing up now might not share the same strength of that unconscious bias that I have. And I think that the kind of people who are getting into politics is changing. And I think that's a really interesting cultural phenomenon. That when you walk into a room, you won't necessarily say, this 55-year-old man in dress pants and a button-down shirt isn't necessarily the most powerful person in the room. And I think that that's what's changing in politics. And this election is certainly a really good crystallized example, given the range of candidates. Although I think it's sort of a generational change.
One last thing on this forecast, and then we'll move on to the next segment. But I asked listeners for their takeaways, and I have to say a number of people responded and said, I look at the model and I understand what it's telling me, but at some fundamental level, I think Russian interference or hacking, and I kind of don't know what to believe, and I don't know what's true, and I don't know if there's this big looming X factor that would totally scuttle everything I'm seeing in front of me.
What, they think that Russians are going to...
Yeah, that this election might go totally sideways because of interference. So I don't expect us to have an answer to that, but Claire, how do you respond to someone who says something like that or has that big looming fear?
I think I'll say, going back to 2016, the Russians certainly meddled in the elections. I think Trump would have won regardless. That's my kind of instinct, is that we've remade a little bit of our history after 2016 to say Trump won because of Russian meddling. I don't think there's any proof of that. I think when we go forward to the midterms, we certainly aren't prepared in a cyber election security way for possible Russian attacks on voter registration rolls. I will say to people, it would be harder for people to actually change votes and tamper votes. I think that's a little bit of a outside scenario. That doesn't say it's not possible. I think the way that the Russians are influencing the election is more in the sort of social media realm of things. That's probably the more immediate cause. So it's certainly a worry, but I don't necessarily buy this kind of revisionist history that Trump won because of Russian influence in a couple of districts. Micah, you seem skeptical. I just don't think we can say that.
No, we can't say that. I could certainly make that argument. The election was so close that you could put Trump winning down to anything. I guess what I'd say is, as Claire has written, it is certainly possible, given the state of preparedness in the U.S., that there will be all sorts of shenanigans in 2018. But if you're looking at information and doubting it because of the prospect of hacking, they've already won. So trust trusted sources is what I would tell those people.
And at some level, the model will reflect that. A straight up hack that changes a bunch of votes at the last second, perhaps not, but just this larger cultural environment that we're living in, which, as Claire was pointing out, was a lot of the goal of the Russian sort of program.
The model would pick up on through polls.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's leave it there. We are obviously going to continue to talk about the model going forward, and we will have 2 more models on the way. But for the rest of the show, we're going to get a bit more wonky and dive into some data about Trump's coalition. First, though, let me tell you that today's podcast is brought to you by Lightstream. Have you ever looked at your credit card statement and been shocked by the interest rate? I certainly have. Did you know that you could actually roll all of your credit card debt into one monthly payment at a lower fixed rate? Lightstream offers credit card consolidation loans from 5.89% APR with autopay. That's lower than the average credit card interest rate of over 18% APR. The average credit card interest rate is over 18%. You can get a loan with Lightstream from $5,000 to $100,000, and you can even get your funds as soon as the day that you apply. Lightstream believes that people with good credit deserve a great interest rate and no fee. Listeners, you can now get a special discount on top of Lightstream's already low rates. The only way to do it is to go to lightstream.com/538. That's the numbers, lightstream.com/538, lightstream.com/538. I don't know if that was any easier. Lightstream.com/538. Subject to credit approval. Rate includes 0.5% autopay discount. Terms and conditions apply, and offers are subject to change without notice. Visit lightstream.com/538 for more information. All right, we're back, and we're going to take a detailed look at who is in the Trump coalition and how the coalition feels about President Trump today. To do that, we're going to work from Pew's recently published American Trends panel. So a number of listeners flagged this for us and suggested that we do it for good use of polling or bad use of polling. We're going to one-up you. We're going to do a full segment about this. Essentially, what Pew did is they had the same voters take a survey every month so that we can see how their views have changed over time, starting back in April of 2016. So we get a nice picture both of the makeup of Trump's coalition and the changes within it. But first, from a polling perspective, are there advantages or disadvantages to this kind of survey compared to traditional polling?
There are advantages and disadvantages. Yeah.
So the answer is yes. We should move on.
Yes. No. So, Advantage is you get to see how people change their mind, don't change their mind, evolve their thinking, etc. Disadvantage is what's the name of it when the act of doing an experiment,
Heisenberg principle?
That thing. Yeah. In asking people to take a survey repeatedly, you're sort of asking them to behave unlike everyone else in the country. And so, I think their thinking and political beliefs could be affected by that. But it's certainly a worthwhile form of surveying.
So, Claire, anything that jumps out to you in terms of what it actually shows?
Well, I think that the top line that most of President Trump's coalition is still, how do they phrase it? They feel warmly about him.
Very warm.
That they share similar feelings of warmth that they did in November of 2016. They are similarly warm in July or August, whatever the last time they measured this was, which I think is interesting. I mean, this is something I think we should bring up, that we were very curious about the Trump coalition. So we had a series where we did polling with SurveyMonkey to track a kind of group of voters that we called reluctant Trump voters. So typically white, college-educated, suburban voter types. And we wanted to see if they were still going to like Trump, a year in, a few months in, and they did. Yeah, they still liked him, which is kind of what the survey found.
Yeah, so for our survey, the reluctant Trump voters, these were people who, what we were trying to get at were people who had an unfavorable view of Trump,
right,
but still voted for him.
Right.
The Pew equivalent of that is probably...
What do they call them? Like
converts? Yeah, skeptics.
Skeptics or converts. But it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure listeners will remember all the articles that were written in the first year of Trump's presidency that was like, how do Trump voters in TK Iowa district or TK Ohio or Pennsylvania district feel about him? And all the articles concluded that they felt good about him. They felt good about their vote. So in some ways, this is like the voter panel equivalent of that.
Yeah, it's in one sense, it's not surprising at all, right? It's like, look, Trump's coalition, Trump won the White House with an incredibly small coalition, given that he won the White House. He lost the popular vote, right? In that sense, it is not surprising that people who voted for him, have largely not changed their minds, right? The key, though, there is if you're limiting who you're looking at to people who voted for Trump, you're inherently limiting the amount of change you're going to see, right? Because it's like a selection bias, right? You're picking a group of people who had made a very strong decision to vote for Trump. If you look at the Pew data, what you see is prior to like the stretch run of the 2016 campaign, a lot of Trump supporters actually had what Pew calls cool or less than warm feelings towards Trump. It was really only like in the September and beyond period where the kind of overwhelming support you see now, where he starts to seize that. So to me, what that says is, even given these numbers, I think it's really easy to overrate the permanence of Trump's support.
And I guess within a narrow-ish coalition, as you're describing, a small amount of erosion matters more because of sort of how narrow that victory was. So, I mean, there has been some erosion, not a ton. Again, the top line here is mostly it's steady. But are there any particular parts of the coalition that feel like they have soured on Trump, either from this data or just in our reporting?
The women.
Yeah.
Women, there's a gender gap now. Women are much less likely to enthusiastically or warmly support Trump than they did in 2016, which I think is pretty interesting. If you'll remember, 2016 had I believe the biggest gender gap that we have seen in modern American history, and that has filtered a bit into Trump's coalition.
Yeah, so this was super interesting. As Pew found that in November 2016, among Trump supporters, there were no real differences in gender, right? There are now. On gender and on education, a gap has opened up where women and college-educated voters, again, we're just talking about Trump supporters here, are more likely to have cooler feelings towards Trump.
But that's mimicking the top-line trends of the 2016 election.
Which is sort of amazing.
Yeah.
It's like there's a gender gap and an education gap even among Trump voters.
Yeah.
It's just like a delayed reaction.
It's like a fractal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a fractal. Now, the number of female Trump supporters and college-educated Trump supporters who have soured on Trump is small. It's like, okay, so here's Pew compared feelings towards Trump in April 2016 to feelings towards Trump in March of this year, right? 59% felt warmly both times. So that's Trump's base, right? That's like the hardcore, they were with him before, they're with him now. 12% were skeptical then, they're skeptical now, right? They feel coolly then, they feel coolly now. 23% felt cool then, warm now. To me, this is like the kind of Scott Walkers of the world or the Ron Johnsons of the world. So like rocked-ribbed Republicans who didn't love Trump but have kind of come on board. And if you're in their shoes...
Party people.
Yeah, exactly. Party people. And if you're in their shoes, you got a tax cut, you know, the economy's doing well, you know, you're probably doing okay. Only 6% of Trump supporters are in the disillusioned bucket, which means they felt warmly in April 2016. They feel coolly now. That's a small group of people. Now it's more like that group is more likely to be college educated, more likely to be women, and it's small. But Jody, to what you said earlier is true, which is Trump's coalition was so small to begin with that even a tiny erosion in that puts Republicans and Trump in 2020 in danger.
Sort of moving a little bit to who's actually in this coalition, not just sort of how they've changed. I mentioned that one thing this Pew study does is maybe change our notion of what we learned from the exit polls in 2016. So the exit polls in 2016, I'll remind folks, showed Trump winning college-educated white voters, and now we're starting to get a sense that maybe that's not entirely true, or maybe that's not as overwhelming of a narrative as we maybe expected.
Yeah, so Pew, I mean, look, even going off the exit polls, we thought that education was like this, had become this new dividing line.
That was the biggest thing I remember from that night.
Yeah.
Right. And Pew's data suggests it is even starker than we thought. So I don't think that changes that much, actually.
But it is, I mean, I think we should say one thing that is interesting and notable is that Republicans have historically won college-educated white voters. And so the fact that they didn't, that revelation, that change from what we understood, I do think is interesting.
No, it's definitely interesting.
So in the broader history of American politics, I think it's a sort of striking thing.
And could have a huge effect on 2018. You know, historically, groups aligned with the Democratic Party have been less likely to turn out in midterm elections. So younger voters, non-white voters, low-income voters. More educated voters, though, are more likely to turn out.
Dope for Democrats.
Yeah, exactly. So now Democrats might finally have a group that, like, you know, turns out in midterms. Yeah.
None of those kids.
Those damn kids. Sure, they're making a lot of racket, but will they show up at the polls?
They're just listening to their rap songs and their Miley Cyrus. Can't get their asses to the polls.
What was that accent you slipped into there?
That was good.
This is a Midwestern accent, Jody.
Good to know. Good to know.
Haven't you ever been to a Fresh Fry?
But to that point, and I think we touched on it a little bit in the first segment as well, there's this temptation that whenever, I mean, Trump is such an overwhelming narrative right now, and we see these studies about Trump voters, and there's a temptation to try and draw direct lines to this election, the 2018 election. How apples and oranges is it? Should we look at data from 2016 and say it teaches us X, Y, Z lessons for 2018? Should we largely be skeptical of the lines you can draw between the presidential and the midterm?
The president isn't on the ballot.
Yeah.
Which is going to be, I think, important in some districts.
I think that's right. I mean, let's use the House forecast as a way to answer this, right? So the model looks at a presidential approval rating. It looks at how that has related historically to the tendency in these midterms for the president's party to lose seats, right? But that is just one of a bunch of stuff it's looking at. So it's also looking at congressional approval ratings, how the incumbent in each district did historically, fundraising, right? In other words, I'm going to make this up as a fraction, but let's say Trump's popularity is like, you know, 1/10 of what the model is looking at, or 1/5, let's say, whatever, right? That's probably about, you know, how much influence it has, or how big of a factor it is relative to everything else, as Claire was saying.
Okay, that's a wrap. Let's leave it there. Thank you to Claire.
Thanks,
as
Jody.
always. Welcome back. Thanks to you, Micah.
Managing editor, Micah.
Oh, sorry, Jesus.
Please get it. right, Jody.
And thanks to you listeners for listening. Again, if you want to help us with a listener feedback survey, visit podcast.study and take a few minutes and tell us what you think. You know what? You're even allowed to critique whether it's a good use of polling or surveying or not, as long as you just take the survey.
That's a good use.
Tell us what you think.
That's a good use.
Good use.
It helps us.
Surveying is it helps us and our ad sales team get a sense of who's listening to this podcast and what we can do better. Anyway, my name is Jody Avirgan. Galen Druk is our producer. Tony Chow is in the control room. You can get in touch by emailing us podcasts@538.com. You can also, of course, tweet at us with any questions or comments. And remember, we're going to be doing Model Talk about every other week through the election. People are already emailing us a bunch, so keep them coming. You can email podcasts@538.com. If you're a fan of the show, leave us a rating or a review in the Apple Podcast Store. When you leave a rating, it helps our rankings, which helps others discover the show. If you are pleased or displeased about the return of the music, let us know by writing a review.
I don't really give a
No, yeah.
I'm saying by writing a review.
Just write a nice review.
Just write a nice review. Say you're happy the music's back, 5 stars, and just go on with your day.
You'll listen if we tell you to listen.
Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.